Welcome in this video of the House of Asian Cinema. When we discuss about Korean cinema, what comes to mind are directors such as Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, Kim Ki-duk or Im Kwon-taek. But by doing so, we identify Korean cinema to South Korea. We forget there is another Korea, North Korea, which has its own film industry. In this video, we will discover North Korean film history and have a look at some of its most interesting movies. At the end of the Second World War, Korea, until then a Japanese colony, was divided in two different entities, with the border set on the 38th parallel. On one side, in the north, a regime modeled on the Stalinist USSR, with a former resistance leader as its head, Kim Il-sung. On the other, in the south, a capitalist regime under the influence of the USA, with a former exiled for leader, Syngman Rhee. Originally supposed to be temporary until regular elections could be organized, it became definitive in 1948, when the South became the Republic of Korea and the North followed soon after to become the Democratic Popular Republic of Korea. According to a famous quote by Lenin, "Cinema is for us, of all the arts, the most important." That was the case in North Korea as well. Thanks to Soviet help, infrastructures needed to produce local films were quickly set up. And in 1949, My Home Village, the first North Korean film, was released. Directed by Kong Hong-sik, we follow Gwan Pil, a peasant exploited by his landlord during the Japanese colonization. Tired of the constant scolding he receives, he hits his landlord and is sent in a Japanese jail. Here, he meets Ak-chun, a soldier from Kim Il-sung's guerrilla. The two men manage to escape and find back the resistance. Gwan Pil joins a small army and can participate in the liberation of his country. The film is the first step in the making of two subgenres which would become the cornerstones of North Korean cinema for the several decades to follow. Film criticizing the Korean feudal system of exploitation and films glorifying the anti-Japanese resistance. These two subgenres do base themselves on a real historical context. Ancient Korea was indeed a very unequal society, with rigid social classes where the aristocratic elite was exploiting its peasant majority. Also, there was indeed an active resistance against the colonial project Japan had for Korea. But there were also clear political objectives in the depiction made by the film. By condemning the old system, the new regime of the popular democracy sought some legitimacy. To achieve that objective, the only resistance movement being shown is the one of Kim Il-sung, and it is him who saved Korea from the Japanese occupation. Of course, that was not the case. Anti-Japanese guerrilla back then had many different incarnations and political orientations, and the end of the Japanese colonial regime had more to do with the Soviet intervention. But in My Home Village, we already find the essence of the North Korean cinema to be the glorification of an alternative reality to serve the interests of the state. The Korean War, which started the following year, pushed the local production in another direction, to support the war effort. War films in which northern troops fight heroically, often in numeric inferiority, against a cruel and vicious enemy. Once again, it would become one of the main subgenres of North Korean cinema for the decades to come. After the Korean War stopped in 1953, the country started its rebuilding process. With the support of other members of the Warsaw Pact and thanks to the infrastructure inherited from the Japanese colonial time, it was achieved at an impressive speed. The new regime could then start its objective of building a new society based on equality and fairness for the greater prosperity of its people. But the result ended up being far from the communist ideal. What ended up being built was a Stalinian society, fiercely nationalist and falsely self-reliant. Adding up to the subgenre already discussed, the North Korean film industry was mobilized to paint a more flattering image of this new society and help the audience forget the problems of reality. The North Korean film industry found itself under special attention starting from the mid-1960s, when Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son, was put in charge of the propaganda department. A real lover of the art, he tried to improve the technical standards but also to politicize even more the films being produced. He chose to have more films dealing with the anti-Japanese guerrilla led by his father in order to improve his standing in the upcoming succession. Thus were produced films such as The Flower Girl, probably one of the most famous North Korean films, or Sea of Blood. In 1973, Kim Jong-il published On the Art of Cinema, a book with his thoughts about the way films had to be made. The central element of its reflections lie in the importance of the political message the film has to push. An idea at the heart of all North Korean film production, except during a specific time period, the 1980s, at the initiative of Kim Jong-il himself. Kim Jong-il's lobbying succeeded and he gradually took over his father at the head of the country. Now enjoying full powers and aware of the gradual loss of influence the film industry was experiencing, he decided to start a new production policy with a greater focus on entertainment. To achieve it, he used another North Korean policy then in full swing: international kidnapping. He made his men abduct Choi Eun-hee, one of the greatest female stars of South Korean cinema during the 50s and 60s, and her former husband, director Shin Sang-ok. With their help, new productions with higher technical standards and higher entertainment value were initiated. Thus were produced Pulgasari, the first and only North Korean kaiju, Dong, a martial art film based on a local Korean Robin Hood, or Order No. 27, an action commando film. This time period is the golden age of North Korean cinema. The escape of Choi Eun-hee and Shin Sang-ok and the fall of the USSR a few years after drew a close to this period of relaxation. North Korea entered its darkest time since the war with the South, having to face the collapse of its economic system, which relied heavily on foreign help to be sustainable, and a series of famine. In this context, nicknamed the Arduous March by North Koreans, the film industry went back to produce films with obvious propaganda objectives, describing an even more idealized version of the country. For instance, Myself in the Distant Future, which criticized the lack of ideological commitment in the new generation, or the Nation and Destiny series, proposing idealized biographies of famous personalities who migrated of their free will to North Korea. Since the country has moved on from this difficult time period of its history, it has enjoyed a fairly new stability. But its film industry is merely a shadow of itself. Films are still produced, but the competition from South Korea, smuggled in the north, have weakened the local industry. Even so, there are still some attempts to find the audience favor locally, but also sometimes internationally. In the first case, there are Seoul's Protest, dubbed the Korean Titanic, the Taekwondo film Pyongyang Nalfaram. In the second category, we can list Comrade Kim Goes Flying, co-produced with Belgium and the United Kingdom. This quick historical background complete, let's make a few general observations when it comes to North Korean films. From a technical standpoint, North Korean cinema reached its peak at the end of the 60s. Since then, even during its golden age of the 80s, the outdated equipment led to washed-out cinematography, making even the most recent films look like they were shot 40 years earlier. Because of this constraint, camera moves are limited. Some improvements in this area were made in the 80s, but they still remain fairly weak compared to the standards of world cinema. Perhaps because of these technical limitations, the local filmmakers seem unable to highlight the beauty of their country. Despite what many believe, there are actually many opportunities in the evocative landscapes of the North Korean countryside or in the peculiar aesthetic of Pyongyang. But in films, everything looks flat and uninspired. Thematically, DPRK films always push an idea then brought forward by the propaganda department, sometimes very trivial. For example, in They Met on the Taedong River, it is the promotion of manual labor, underappreciated by the local population. Other films promote respecting the traffic regulations or to take better care of fruit harvest. A typical North Korean film will almost systematically have a scene in which the main character will deliver a speech reminding other characters of the great leader thoughts, the said thoughts illuminating the crowd by their wisdom. It is quite often the emotional and thematical climax of the film. Actors often have very artificial-looking performances, but it probably lies in part on the way scripts and dialogues are written. Films set before the establishment of the DPRK have very stereotypical characters, with extremely vicious landlords and Japanese. On the other hand, when films are set in the DPRK, the highly idealized description of the society imply for all the characters to be intrinsically good, and conflicts based on misunderstanding or a wrong sense of priority. It's difficult to give realistic performances when you have to sustain this fiction over 1 hour. For all these reasons, one must admit that North Korea has little to offer to the fan of good films. They are mostly a window on an anachronistic society frozen in a state of Stalinian decay. But there are a few films which deserve a viewing. Here are 5 of them. Kkok Jong is a 5-film series directed by Jang Yong-bok and based on an outlaw who was executed in 1562. His actions were immortalized and romanticized in a series of novels published between 1928 and 1939. The production of the film series was initially supervised by Shin Sang-ok and took 7 years, from 1986 for the first episode to 1993 for the last. 5 films to tell this story is clearly too much, and there are some dull moments. Still, it is a tale of epic proportion, rich in tears and fury. The best of the 5 is most likely the second episode. As it is often the case for films set during that time period, the main dramatic plot point is the exploitation by the gentry and landlords of the working class. After having endured many humiliations in the first film, the Herculean Kkok Jong chooses to rebel and unite other peasants in his struggle against the abusive aristocracy in the second film of the series. Often aired on TV following its theater run, the film series disappeared from the screens around 2000. Local authorities, fearing the population could be inspired by the revolutionary spirit of Rhim. Pulgasari is one of the most famous North Korean films. Often derided, it is actually amongst what North Korean cinema has best to offer. It was directed mostly by Shin Sang-ok, but finished by his assistant, Chung Won-jo, following the former defection. An authentic local blockbuster, 15 technicians from Toho who had previously worked on the Godzilla series were hired to give life to the title monster. Once again, it's about a peasant revolt against the feudal power in place, embodied here by a tyrannical king. But the Shin Sang-ok touch means the message is less heavy-handed than usual. We can even wonder if the South Korean filmmaker was not including a hidden message when describing this king who let his subjects die of hunger in order to build weapons and strengthen his army. From a technical standpoint, the film is fairly solid, with charming old-fashioned special effects. It sometimes feels like we are watching a film from the 60s, some kind of Korean version of Daimajin. But that's the case for most of the North Korean film production, and it doesn't prevent the film from being an entertaining keiju. A bit of a cheat on this one because Gandahar is not a North Korean production. It is an animation feature by the best French director in this field, René Laloux. If the film is listed here, that is because it was mostly made in North Korea. An adaptation from the French science fiction writer Jean-Pierre Andrevon, titled The Machine Man vs. Gandahar, we follow Sylvain in his investigation on the presence of mysterious machine men who decimate any life form on the planet. Making an animation feature outside of France was nothing new for Laloux. His leftist orientation and lower production costs had led him to direct Fantastic Planet in Czechoslovakia and Times Masters in Hungary. North Korea already had some experience in the animation department, having produced cartoons since 1957. But the relocation of the French team in North Korea brought many difficulties. For instance, the bare appearance of some characters was source of confusion for the North Korean crew, or the interdiction to pin any images on the wall except for the leader portraits required very creative solutions. Despite this difficult production, the result is a high-quality science fiction film. The experience also marked the birth of a profitable subcontracting business for the North Korean animation studio for cartoon producers all over the world. Story of Our Home, directed by Ri Yoon-ho and Ha Yong-ki, is one of the most recent North Korean films produced. The main character is Jong-ha, a young student who uses all her free time to help 3 young orphans. But the eldest of the 3, Eun-jong, does not accept her help that she thinks is out of pity. This melodrama was inspired by a real story which was even covered by international media. Big change for a North Korean film, the cinematography, the direction and the editing are much more modern and dynamic. At last, it feels like we are watching a film which looks like it was made in 2016. The actors' performances are also noteworthy for their credibility, spontaneity and expressivity, important qualities for a melodrama. Taken for what it is, Story of Our Home is an authentic success. Too bad the film falls into the usual North Korean leader and party glorification in its last third act. Meet in Pyongyang is a co-production between mainland China and North Korea directed by Sherzhiati Yae-fu and Kim Yong-chol. The co-production mechanism was not something new for North Korea. They had engaged in co-production earlier with the USSR, Japan and Italy. And it is actually for the best. The presence of foreign film crew helps soften the censorship and bring a new vision of the country. That's what happened on Meet in Pyongyang. We follow Shönherr, a Chinese dancer who is sent to North Korea to study under a local expert in traditional dance. Once here, she learns to be less selfish and open her heart to dance and others. With at last some decent technical materials, the film can show Pyongyang under its best light. The visual climax being the mass games with their epic scale. But the co-production mechanism benefits the film in other ways. The story promotes value of self-sacrifice for the community, in line with what Chinese and North Korean propaganda likes to emphasize, but without the usual heavy-handed approach and with a universal human touch which makes it much easier to accept and embrace. The actors' performances also feel much more genuine and natural. For all these reasons, Meet in Pyongyang is probably the best film to have been produced, or in this case co-produced, in North Korea. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you will have a better understanding of North Korean cinema and it has fed your curiosity in watching some of their films. Don't hesitate to post your questions or observations in the comment below. I will do another video to address them. Until then, I hope to see you back soon on the House of Asian Cinema.